I'm fired up. I hope you're fired up. We got some ground to cover today, people. 2 verses, all right? I heard that. I was like, I'm going to have to fill time. No, I'm barely going to make time, okay? So hang on, buckle up. Let's get into it. First off, recently moved to Folsom, okay? Shout out Folsom people. Where are you at, my Folsom people? All right. I got one word for you, smud. Yeah, smud, man. We thank the Lord for smud today. God has been good through smud. Thank you, Jesus, for smud. Okay, we're not here to talk about PG&E, but what I will say is I love where we're at in Folsom. My parents and my grandpa helped a ton to get this home ready for us to move into, and I had the chance to help with a couple little projects here or there, but when the time finally came to move in, my dad said, hey, I'm leaving a couple elbow grease projects for you, right? You need to get some sweat equity in there. And so I said, all right, ready to go. We get in, and the backyard was at one time a field of weeds and blackberries, and they had done me the help of actually getting rid of that, and so now it was a field of dirt. And my wife looks at me and says, Addie needs grass. That's my daughter's name, if you didn't put that together. Okay, so Addie needs grass, and I was like, okay, it's only 106 degrees outside, but I got this. And so I go out in the backyard, and I don't know, there's a pickaxe there. I'm sorry, Wes, I'm sorry. Wes is a contractor, he's a friend of mine. You need to forgive me after this, I'm sorry. So I get out there with a pickaxe, and I start swinging it at the ground to break up the ground and see what was under there, and made an absolute mess, drenched in sweat, blisters all over my hands. And 45 minutes in, I gave up. Stop it, man. Stop looking at me like that. So I get out there, and I'm like, man, this is gonna be some work, okay? I tell Lexi, I don't know if I can do this, babe, but a few YouTube videos later, I was confident. And so we went to our in-laws' house, and we were hanging out for dinner, and they're like, oh, hey, how's the house going? How are things? And Lexi's like, oh, it's going great. He needs help. It's been super fun. Please help him. It's going super awesome. He can't do this. No, she had my vote of confidence, you know what I'm saying? But she's like, help. And so my father-in-law looks at me and says, like, do you want help? And I was like, yeah, I'll take it. And so he says, well, I'm off the next day, I'll come out. And so he shows up the next day, and he has this like smattering of tools, and many of which I had never seen in my life. And he whips out this thing called a trench shovel, okay? Now, some of y'all in here, you know what that is. You're nodding. You've felt the pain of not using one. I knew that there were 2 types of shovels. Probably many more. One is a square-shaped shovel. The other one looks like a spade thingy from the cards. And so I know what those do, but this little trencher thing, I'm looking at it like, what are you gonna do with that? You know, if you don't know what they look like, it's very skinny and very long and doesn't look much like a shovel. And so a few minutes into it, I look over, and he's almost halfway done digging a trench, hence trench shovel, like almost the length of the yard already. And I was just like, how is this possible? And he looked at me and said the perennial life lesson that all people must learn: right tool, right job. Amen, somebody. Okay. Learned a valuable lesson. Fun fact, the other services didn't get this one, but later on I go to like level the thing, and I'm using a shovel. Apparently there's a thing called a landscaping rake. Yes. Thank you, Home Depot. All right. Here's the deal, guys. We need the right tool for the right job. This applies to so many things in life. Can we agree? Like, when it comes to the challenges that we face in life, we need a way of dealing with them, right? And there's so many different tools that life seems to give us, that the world wants to give us, like trying to help us to solve issues, whether it be in our relationships, whether it be at work, whether it be with where you want to go in life, what you want to do. There are different ways that the world wants to offer us solutions and tools to work through it. And God knows in his wisdom that we need help working through life. We need help being able to discern what it is that God wants for us. And so in his wisdom, he gave us the tool to answer it. He gave us the tool to deal with it. And that tool is the gospel. That tool is the gospel. Now, some of you might be in here like, the gospel, like what? The first 4 books of the Bible or the stuff Jesus said? Like what do you mean? The gospel is not just like the 101 class to Christianity, like you heard it one time, you raised your hand, you're good. The gospel is actually the whole thing. It's the whole deal. It's start to finish the redemptive plan of God to make us right with him and bring his rightness to the earth. The gospel is the tool to deal with what we're dealing with every day and in every place. But here's the problem. If we're going to use the gospel as a tool, we have to know it. We have to know the ins and outs of it to be able to benefit from what the gospel does in our lives, which is exactly why Paul writes the letter to the Romans. The letter to the Romans is all about the gospel and how the gospel is meant to unite the church. He walks through the gospel in these incredible sweeping strokes of what it is. But here's what we know about Romans so far. Number one, it's written by Paul, right? Paul hated the church. Hated it, hated what was happening. He thought they were a bunch of crazies, and he was a very first persecutor of the church. He was standing there the first time a Christian was killed for their faith, holding the coats of the people who threw the rocks. He then began the persecution of the church. He would go around throwing Christians in jail for what they believed. One time on his way to a town called Damascus, Jesus stops him in his tracks, okay? The heavens open up, this light comes down, and he's knocked off his donkey onto you get the picture. Okay, so then he has this encounter with this Jesus, and he begins to change from the inside out. What happens is he begins to live in light of this good news, in light of this gospel. And he goes around and turns from somebody who hated Christians to somebody who was making Christians, okay? He became one of the early church planners, going around and getting other faith communities started. And Paul, the very guy who beat Christians, was beaten for his faith. He was thrown in jail for his faith. He was stoned for his faith. He was shipwrecked for his faith. He was bitten by snakes. He had been attacked by thieves. Paul had gone through so much for this gospel that he once hated. He must have believed this thing. He must have strongly believed it to be willing to ultimately die for what he was claiming in Rome. So he writes to Rome saying, I want to tell you about this gospel. And Rome was going through some very interesting problems, okay? There was a new emperor in town, and what he did is he brought the Jewish people back in. The old emperor kicked them out. The new guy said, actually, they were helpful. Let's bring them back. And so imagine, you have this church that gets started, and all the people, for the most part, were pretty similar. They thought the same way, they talked the same way, they act the same way, went to the same restaurants, liked the same music, were into the same stuff. And then a few years later, all these people come back to join this church who are way different. They dress different, they look different, they talk different, have different customs, have an entirely different language. You can imagine it might be a little hard to figure out how to be in community together. I mean, to put it in our terms, pretend there was this global pandemic, right? That hits, and then let's just pretend there's this place called Silicon Valley, and a bunch of people out there realize that they can work on their laptops from home. And so then they came and bought our houses, and then and if you're here from Silicon Valley, I love you. And so they show up, and they're now interacting with these people who've been here a while, and they're like, wait, you got a Range Rover? I got a Tesla, right? And how could you drive a Range Rover? I have drive an electric vehicle, and then people start fighting. No, but yeah, no, I know, weird. I can't believe he said the Tesla thing. Okay, look, we would need something to unite us, right? If something like that were ever to happen. We would need something to bring us together. We need Elon Musk to make a Tesla truck, okay? That can kind of work for both people, all right? Here's the deal though, we need the gospel to unite us. We need the gospel to be what's common among us. We don't have to look the same. We don't have to talk the same or dress the same or drive the same cars. What we need is the gospel because that's what unites us. Paul knows how powerful this gospel message is, that it can take people from totally different backgrounds and bring them together in the new family of God. Do we need the gospel? Yeah. Do we need what Romans has to say to us today? Yes. Okay, we need it. We know we need it. Let's get into it. Here's what Paul says in Romans chapter 1. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by what? You guys are good. You got an A. You're better than the first and second service. Thank you. Okay, here's where he starts. I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed. Now, Paul had every reason to be ashamed, especially in their day. Everybody in their day believed in all kinds of gods, and they would worship whatever god they felt like would get them what they needed at that time. You're telling me there's only one God? And not only is there one God, but he died in the most embarrassing way a person could die? He died a criminal's death on a cross? That's embarrassing. That's the God you're proclaiming? He had every reason to be ashamed. And yet, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel message isn't a message that necessarily you would be proud of because the gospel is offensive. You know what the gospel says? You can't save yourself. That's offensive, especially for me in the 21st century when every self-help book on the charts is telling me I can. You can't save yourself. This message was offensive. This message would have been embarrassing to an honor and shame-driven culture that was proud of what they had done and their accomplishments. He says, I'm not ashamed. You know, shame is something that people try to leverage to change people. You notice that? People try to shame other individuals into certain behaviors or actions. Maybe you have an Android phone and you've joined a group chat with some people with Apple phones, and they're like, who brought the green bubble? You know what I'm saying? Who? You just changed my chain, all right? And then I'm just taking shots at Silicon Valley today. I'm sorry, but Apple's evil. They know what they're doing. They want you to get in there and feel shameful for not having the same chat bubble color. That's how they're trying to manipulate you to buy iPhones, okay? If you have an Android, be proud, okay? Be proud of your Android. I have an iPhone, but you should be proud, all right? I'm kidding. I really do have an iPhone though. Here's the deal. That kind of social pressure does make people change sometimes. There's some people who have just gone out and bought one because of that. In the same way, people want to shame Christianity. I can't believe you're a Christian. You believe in these things in that book? Don't you remember the Crusades? Don't you remember that Christians are bigoted? Don't you know that Christians don't even practice the stuff they preach? You should be ashamed. That's what the world wants to tell us about being a Christian. But Paul looks in the face of anything that would come against being a Christian and says, I am not ashamed. I'm not ashamed. Why? Why would he not be ashamed? He's not ashamed because the gospel itself is what he's proud of. It's not because I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is, it's better than therapy. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it fixed my marriage. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because my kids are finally behaving. No, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel for one reason only, the power of God. That's it. Now, those things may be benefits that come from living in God's perfect plan. But if that's why we're not ashamed, we've made an idol out of the benefit of the gospel. The gospel isn't primarily about you being a better person. It's about the power of God to save you when you couldn't save yourself. So what's the gospel? The gospel is good news. That's what that word means. It just means good news. And yes, the first 4 books of the New Testament are called the Gospels, but the gospel is bigger than just that. It's the entire plan of God to make us right with him. That's the gospel. And what we know is true is the gospel is this, that God had everything he needed and everything he could have ever wanted. He's perfect, He's holy, he's glorious. He didn't need anything to exist. He could have just stayed as himself. But yet, what he chose to do was to create the universe, to create the world, so that others would be able to enjoy how amazing he is. He did it just for the benefit of these people that he wanted to create. But here's what happened. A few days after things get started, humanity decides, I don't want to live God's way, I want to live my way. God set up some very clear boundaries, and they violated those boundaries. They said, no, I think my way's better. And since that day, what has happened, the story of human history, is we have said, we think we've got this handled. And so what has happened is the result is death, the result is rebellion, sickness, disease, the result is war, the result is fighting, the result is any kind of negative ism you could attach something to. That is the result of sin in this world. And any attempt that we have made to make that right by ourselves has failed and will fail. And so what needed to happen is God needed to murder his own son to make you right with him. He needed to literally come to this earth, live the perfect life to show us what it looks like to live the perfect life, and then take his wrath for all of the sin and the hurt and the injustice in this world and pour it out, and to take his love and pour it out in one consummate act on the cross, which is what happens to Jesus. The wrath of God is satisfied. The love of God is magnified and put on display. And we see in that moment the goodness of God and his plan to redeem mankind. And so what he says is, anyone who believes that this is my answer to this problem and will walk in truth with it, they will be saved. That's the gospel. But the gospel doesn't stop there. We could think, oh, the gospel's, we get saved. No, the gospel is now you're there. Now you're a part of the restoration project of the cosmos. Kind of a big deal, kind of a big job. But now we're a part of God restoring the brokenness of creation. That's what we get to do. That's part of the gospel. And so this is the gospel, this news from God. That is good news. I mean, for me, when you hear good news, you want to tell people about it, right? Like for us, Addie, our little baby, she's like just old enough now to where when I come home, I say, I'm gonna get you. And she screams and plays chase, right? And she'll do that for an hour and a half till it's bedtime. And she'll just keep running. And I love it. It's one of my favorite things right now in life. But guess what? I'm telling you that because it's good news for me, right? But there's good news for you. There's good news in the gospel. And because of that, we share it with people. That's part of the nature of the gospel that we get to share with others, is the goodness of what God has done. But we can't understand the good news until we understand the bad news. We need to understand the depravity of ourselves to understand the gravity of the gospel, to quote one of our awesome residents this week. They had a great point on that. Like when we see the depth of what's happened, we get how good God really is. And so this is the gospel. And the gospel is the power of God. It's God's power to save. Anybody in here think they need saving? I know I need saving. You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. I know I need it. I've apologized to more people in the last month than I can count. And that's just because I came back to work. All right, I don't know about you, but I do things that I need to apologize for. I make mistakes. I offend people sometimes, a lot of the time. Sorry, Tesla owners, I love you too. Okay, like there are things that we do in our life that we need saving from. It's not just that. It's also our addictions or our sin or our rebellion or the ways that we hurt other people, the ways that other people have hurt us that we're not willing to work through. Like there are things in our lives that we need saving from. We also need saving from the wrath of God. And so God saves us with the gospel. He saves us from his wrath. He saves us from ourselves. And then he saves us for something. He saves us for life with him, to be able to walk with him and be part of this restoration plan of all of the world. Here's the good news that you need to hear about this power of God. You don't have to be winsome. You don't have to be clever. You don't have to be smart. You don't need people to like you. You don't have to be convincing. If you're going to share the gospel with somebody, the one thing that's going to make the difference is the power of God. I don't have to be funny for this to work. I don't have to be likable for this to work, because it's the power of God that saves. It's not going to be because someone preached a perfect sermon that someone comes to faith. In the same way, your friends that you're trying to share the gospel with, the people in your life you've been begging God to save, they're going to be saved because of the power of God, not because of you. That's good news. That's a relief, because we know that it's going to be God's power that saves, and that is what we need. This power of God, this beautiful picture of salvation, it's something that is for everyone who believes. Everyone. It says everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Let me tell you something. God was first to market with the idea of equality. That was his idea first. You know that? In the first century, name a community where men and women and people of different races and people of different socioeconomic statuses and children would all come together and be called one family. Name a community that was like that in the first century. Name a community that was like that in human history prior to the gospel. The gospel was first to market with equality. It said, you know what, men, you're going to treat women the way that Christ loves the church, right? That's what you're going to do in your marriage relationship. You don't want to be a woman in the first century. Paganism was unkind to women. Paganism was unkind to children. They would sacrifice children. What does the Bible say about children? That they're a gift from God. The Bible says this about slaves and masters. It said, hey, you may be a master, you may have a slave, but get this, your slave is now your brother. That's God's idea. That's God bringing to bear equality, right? And this idea is something that we've tricked ourselves into thinking we made up in Western civilization. We think we came up with it. God was first to market. It was his idea first, so that all people in all places would be united under one name, and that name is Jesus. Amen. There's good news for all people. There's rescue for all people, and that's what the gospel tells us. And in the gospel, verse 17 tells us that the righteousness of God is revealed. The righteousness of God is revealed. You know, the righteousness of God is a very interesting phrase. It doesn't show up a whole lot in the Bible. Righteousness of God. It usually talks about someone being righteous or being unrighteous, about living a righteous way. But what is the righteousness of God? Anybody in here love to be right? I love to be right, okay? Which is really good because you guys don't, apparently. So this is gonna work out well, all right? I love to be right, maybe you don't, but listen, there's times I'll just make stuff up to be right. You know what I'm saying? Nobody else? You're like, can I believe anything he said today? Hopefully there's stuff about the Bible. Okay, look, there are some of us in here where we want to be right. There's some of us, we don't need to be right. But being right is not what the gospel is about. It's not about winning an argument. It's not about being the loudest in the room or stating your thesis loudly and exiting. You know what I'm saying? That is not what it's about. The gospel is the righteousness of the God. It's the rightness of God. It's his perfection. It's his holiness. It's his untouchableness of how perfect he is. Perfect in love, perfect in wisdom, perfect in grace, perfect in truth, perfect in his justice, right? This is the perfection of God. It's the righteousness of God. And the righteousness of God is revealed. The word there is like the apocalypse of righteousness, okay? It's like this massive unveiling of what it really meant to be righteous, okay? It's revealed in God himself. But righteousness, and particularly for us Protestants around here, it kind of got lumped into just one category of like a forensic righteousness, meaning, okay, you're good, you can keep going. But righteousness isn't just meant to be, okay, you're good with God, now you're saved and you're good. Righteousness was something that led to human flourishing. When you hear the righteous talked about in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word was Sadiq, right? The one who is righteous. Wherever they went, the Proverbs, the Psalms, it talks about human flourishing happening because they lived God's way among the people. And when they lived God's way among the people, it led to the flourishing of the community. The way to be right with God is only through Jesus. It's only through the gospel. And that rightness is something that we live out, and it leads to the benefit of others. But the power isn't in the benefit, the power is in the gospel. So the righteousness of God has been revealed. And here's how it works. Because I don't know about you, but I would love to have access to that power that he's talking about, right? This power of the gospel, this power that can save us. I want to know it. So how do we get it? Here's what he says. It is from faith, for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by, say it again, faith, right? It comes down to faith. Faith is the way that we experience the power of God in our life. Now, some of us in here, when you think about the word faith, you might hear it, and it might sound kind of weak. Faith is just faith? It's like trusting? Just like agreeing to? You want me to have faith? Faith sounds like I have to shut my brain off. Faith sounds like I have to not think hard about things. Faith sounds like just a foolish thing to do. Why would God say it's from faith, for faith, by faith? Let's start back in Habakkuk, okay? This is a quote from Habakkuk 2, verse 4. And what Habakkuk did is he was an Old Testament prophet from 630 BC, and here's what he does. He writes a letter to God, and he complains. He says, I'm mad about some stuff, God. Things don't seem to be working out the way you said it would. Like, I'm worried, I'm mad, where are you, where'd you go? And you know what God did? He answered Habakkuk. He answers him in that book, and you get to hear God explain to him how these things work. And you know what everything was rooted in Habakkuk? The character of God. Every answer he gives him is based on who he is. It's based on his character. You know, that's where we find the gospel. The good news of God is found in the character of God. And he says in Habakkuk that the way you will flourish in this life is through righteousness, and that righteousness comes by faith. So this isn't an idea that just showed up on the scene when the New Testament stuff starts happening. Faith has been the key from the get-go. We'll see that in Romans chapter 4 when we get there. But faith is it. So what is it? You know, the thing with faith is, especially when it comes to the Christian faith, I've got like a mountain of evidence that I can just quote for fun and be like, yeah, well, did you know there's been over 70,000 archaeological digs in Israel since 1950? And every one of them has corroborated the testimony of the Bible. Did you know that the universe began to exist, which means it has to have a cause? When red light shift was discovered, which is how we developed the Big Bang Theory, the prevailing model of the universe was that the universe had always existed. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the world began to exist. And so for years, people looked at Christians like they were stupid for believing in a beginning. And then they found a beginning. And they're like, shoot. They literally say, there are atheists who are quoted saying, we're going to have to rethink what we believe now, because they found there's a beginning to everything. We could sit here for hours and talk about the argument for morality. We could talk about the argument from aesthetics. We could do that. But at the end of the day, what you would have to do is decide whether or not you're going to live by faith. Because these are the facts. This is the evidence that you can look at, but you still have to make a decision of acting and living in accordance to it. So maybe you're here and you're like, I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I'm not about this thing. Let me tell you this. You live by faith. You have faith. There are plenty of things that you have faith in. For example, how do you know there's no God in the universe? How do you know? Have you been to every part of the universe? Have you seen everything in the universe? The universe is a big place. How do you know? You see, you have a presupposition that God can't exist. You have a faith that God can't exist, which is why you say God doesn't exist. You have faith in that. You have faith that when you say something like, when people die, this is all that there is. You just live, you die, and that's it. How do you know? Have you been there? Have you died? It's an unknowable thing, right? And so there has to be some element of faith for you to say that this is it. Or if you sit there and you say, there's no way that miracles are possible. So you're telling me that there are no unexplained natural phenomena. There's never been a single time where natural phenomena didn't match up with our model of that natural phenomenon. That's a faith claim. And so even to not believe in God is to have a faith. It's to have faith in what you think about the universe. And at the end of the day, it's faith that you know these things. Can you know these things reliably? What I know is true is my faith in God is something that I can count on. I have faith in a being who has been pre-existent, who knows better than I do, and who I trust with these issues. That doesn't mean I don't think hard. That doesn't mean I don't ask hard questions. That doesn't mean I haven't asked questions about the beginning of the universe and how old is it and how does that work? Like, it doesn't mean that. What it does mean is at the end of the day, when I've looked at the evidence, I say, all right, I have faith that God is who he said he is. That's the difference. You have faith in yourself and your ability to think and to know these things. I have faith in a being who knows all these things. We live by faith all the time. You lived by faith by walking in here. You believed that there was going to be something here. You sat down in a chair that you believed was going to hold your weight. We practice this all the time, which is why we're so numb to it on some level. We're constantly living and acting on faith. The question is, who or what is your faith in? Can you count on it? Can you test it? Here's what we see is true about faith from the way Paul's explaining it. It's more than just trusting. It's an allegiance and a reliance on God rather than on human abilities or our own activities or our own assurances. It's relying on God. It's allegiance to God. That's the kind of faith that we find the power of the gospel in. We don't get the gospel unless we live by faith. But there's good news for that too, okay? Because guess where that faith comes from? God. God gives us the faith. God gives us faith to have faith in him. It's a beautiful thing because we can't take credit for any of it. And so we can trust in God. Guys, this is barely the tip of the iceberg. We get to do this for like months, okay? Talking about the gospel and going through Romans. I love the way it's laid out. Like chapters 1 through 8 is here's the gospel, okay? Chapters 9 through 11 is who's the gospel for? Spoiler alert, everyone. And then 12 through 16 is how do you live the gospel? It all comes back to that, and it all comes back to being united by what God has done, the good news of his plan to rescue us from ourselves. And so 3 truths we need to know about the gospel are this. Here's one. We don't need to be ashamed of the gospel. You're gonna leave here today, go to lunch or whatever, and you're gonna check your social media feed, and you're gonna wanna be tempted to be embarrassed by being a Christian again. You don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to be embarrassed. Have Christians done stupid things? Yes, we do a lot of stupid things. But also, we've been redeemed by a God who pays for stupid things, so we try not to do stupid things. You follow? We don't have to be ashamed. We know that the gospel is going to be the right tool for whatever we're facing. Put another way, the gospel is the only viable solution to life's greatest problems. You're going to need the gospel when you encounter the hardest parts of this life. You're going to need that tool, and God designed it for you so that you could navigate through it. And so if it's the answer to these problems, we need to know the gospel to live the gospel. We have to know it inside and out. For example, let's say you're having an argument with a friend, right? A coworker or something. You're arguing with them about something that they said, that you said, whatever. Or maybe a spouse. Actually, let's not go there today. Okay, so let's say you're arguing with a friend at work, all right? Well, what does the gospel have to say about your argument with them? What you can do is you look at the entire narrative of Scripture and you take it and you bring it to bear onto the situation. For example, God had no reason to forgive us whatsoever. We didn't even say sorry first. We didn't even start it. We didn't say, God, I'm sorry, can you fix this? No, God was just like, this is bad, I'm gonna fix it. So what does that mean for how we begin the process of forgiveness? Does the person have to say sorry first before we start? That is just a little bit of the beginning of it, just a little bit. There's so much more to the gospel. What God did to pay for our sin, what God did to make us right, how we live in this restoration of what God's doing to creation. The gospel can apply to any situation, but we have to know it to be able to bring it into the situation. We have to know it to be able to understand how the power of God can work in what we're dealing with. But what we know is good about the gospel is it is the power of God, okay? It's the power of God that we can count on through whatever we're going in life. I love you guys. I'm really excited for what's gonna happen in this series as we keep unpacking the gospel. But next, would you just stand and let's just sing to God about this victory that we have in him because he has rescued us from ourselves. Let's worship.